Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining another Novec Talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. And thank you for joining. Our agenda today will be very similar to our previous talks last year. I will give a very short welcome first. Then we will have our Novec early career researcher for this week, which is Lin Wu from the University of Amsterdam. And then we will have our main speaker for today, Professor Dave Rand from MIT. And at the end, we will have 15 minutes of questions and answers. My usual reminder that this speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center at the University of Pennsylvania that does consulting, research, and training to enable organizations around the world to enact positive behavioral change. You have our webpage here, some of our partner programs in this series, and if you follow the QR code, you can follow us on Twitter. As you probably already know, we have announced our spring programming. You have all the names here. If you go to our webpage, novectalks.com, or you scan this QR code, you can see the full information. We are completing a few of the titles and abstracts of these talks, but these are the dates. The same link, the same time, every 2 weeks on Thursdays. And in the website, of course, you can find the videos of all our previous talks. A very small announcement, the center is launching in February a new blog, which is co-managed between our center and the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences. We will let you know when we launch with the first post, but if you'd like to do a proposal for a post, please follow this QR code. I will post the link for the form in the chat a little bit later. And a few ground rules, which are the same as before. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. If you can, please keep your camera on to have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can either use the chat at any time during the talk. We don't have a co-author today, but it will be monitored, or you can use the raise hand function at the end. And then, as always, we are transmitting live on Facebook in our Facebook page, and you can find the recordings of these and other talks in our webpage. We will post next week this video. With that, I'm going to show you today's early career researcher pre-recorded video. The author is Lin Wu, a PhD candidate from the University of Amsterdam. If you follow this link or scan this QR code, you can see Lin's LinkedIn profile to connect. And I think Lin is in the audience today. So if you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to connect, please feel free to write in the chat. Okay, sorry about that. Let's share the video.
Hello, my name is Lin Wu. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Amsterdam. Together with my colleagues, I've been conducting a meta-analysis on willful ignorance, which is what I'm going to talk about in this video. Willful ignorance refers to the behavior where people avoid information about the negative consequences of self-serving decisions. Examples of this behavior can be found in everyday lives, such as consumers who purchase cheap but unethical products, companies that ignore reports about how their production has harmful environmental impact, or people who ignore evidence of climate change so that they can keep the comfortable lifestyle. Given the damaging nature of willful ignorance, it is important that we understand its drivers and consequences. So our meta-analysis aims to tackle the following questions. To what extent do people avoid inconvenient information? How does it impact their subsequent behavior? And how robust are these effects to contextual and personal factors? The key experimental paradigm to study willful ignorance was introduced in a seminal work by Dana Weber and Huang in 2007. We're interested in the results from two key treatments. In a full information treatment, which functions as a controlled condition, participants are asked to choose between two options, A and B. Option A is the selfish option, yielding a payoff of $6 for the participant themselves and $1 for another passive player. Option B is a prosocial option, yielding an equal payoff of $5 for both. In the full information treatment, 47% of participants act altruistically by choosing option B, foregoing $1 profit to provide the other passive player with $5 instead of $1. Participants in the experimental hidden information treatment are faced with a similar choice, knowing that option A yields $6 and option B $5 for themselves. Importantly, however, they do not know the consequences of choosing A or B for the other person. They do know that option A has 50% chance of providing the other persons with $1 in a conflicting state and 50% chance of providing $5 in a non-conflicting state. Before choosing between A and B, they can choose to privately and costlessly reveal how much the other person will receive if they choose A or B. Alternatively, they may choose not to reveal the information and make the decision between A and B without the additional knowledge. What is intriguing about the result is that compared to the controlled treatment, where the majority acted altruistically by choosing option B, when given the choice to avoid information in the hidden information treatment, 8 out of 16 participants in the conflicting situation avoided information, and all 8 out of 8 made the selfish choice. This suggests that participants willfully avoid information, even if, or perhaps because, it is relevant for their choice. Now, such intriguing findings lead to the theory that there is a group of reluctant altruists. Consider this two-type model where there is only two types of people in the world, selfish and altruistic. Only altruistic people would make the altruistic choice in the full information treatment, and they would continue making the altruistic choice in the hidden information treatment. Selfish people will not be making any altruistic choice. And thus, there will be no difference in the level of altruism between the two treatments. Now, consider the three-type model, which includes a group of reluctant altruists. In the full information treatment, both altruists and reluctant altruists will act altruistically. Reluctant altruists do so because they feel the social pressure to give to other people. Yet, when the opportunity arises, they will switch to acting selfishly by avoiding the relevant information. Thus, if reluctant altruists exist and they engage in willful ignorance, we should see a drop in the level of altruism when comparing the full information treatment and the hidden information treatment, as it has been shown in the previous experiment by Dana and colleague. Now, to test the robustness of such findings and establish evidence for willful ignorance, we searched for relevant literature. Overall, we obtained 22 studies consisting of 56 different treatments. Analyzing 13,007 decisions made by 6,436 participants, we found clear evidence for willful ignorance. First, let's look at the left panel of this graph. Here, we plot out the 56 different effect sizes that we included in our dataset. The green dots represent the fraction of altruistic choice in the full information treatment, and the red dots represent the fractions of altruistic choice in the hidden information treatment. Clearly, as you can see, there's a big gap between treatments. On average, the overall weighted gap between the two treatments is 15.6 percentage point. On the right panel, we're showing what the fraction of altruistic choice in the full information treatment remains in the hidden information treatment. Here, we found that the probability of an altruistic choice in the hidden information treatment is only 72% of that in the full information treatment. This is strong evidence for the three-type model and for willful ignorance. With evidence supporting the three-type model, we can further estimate the fraction of each type. We estimate that on average, 40% of people will avoid inconvenient information when given the opportunities, and about 16% of people in the population are reluctant altruists, and these are the people that drive the difference in the level of altruism between treatments. This finding proves to be very robust to situational factors. That includes temptation for the decision makers and harm for the recipients. Regarding personal factors, we found higher level of altruism among older people. However, this is partly due to reluctant motives rather than a true concern for others. So that was a very brief summary of our study. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments and all questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn, for your great presentation. As before, unfortunately, we don't have time to do live questions, but I do see Lynn in the audience. So again, if you have any questions, comments, or you'd like to connect, please feel free to write in the chat and you can communicate there. And also there's the LinkedIn page and QR code there. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, our main speaker, Professor Dave Rand from the MIT Sloan School of Management. Professor Rand is the Erwin H. Shell Professor and Professor of Management Science and Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. He is the director of the Applied Cooperation Team and an affiliate of the MIT Institute of Data, Systems and Society, and the Initiative on the Digital Economy. His work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the American Economic Review, among others. And he has also written popular press articles for outlets including the New York Times, Wired, New Scientist, and Psychological Observer. The talk, of course, is called Understanding and Reducing Online Misinformation Across 16 Countries on 6 Continents. And the moderator for today, as in many previous occasions, will be Dr. Oygon Demand, an associate professor of practice in behavioral and decision sciences here at Penn, and a core member of our center. So yeah, Professor Rand, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much for the invitation and for setting up this cool series, and also thanks to Lynn for that very interesting lightning presentation. I love this format. It's cool to get to see what other people are working on. So this is great, and I will monitor the chat as as feasible while things are going on, but mostly I'll probably do, other than clarifying questions, I'll come back to it at the end. Okay, so unfortunately, misinformation is a topic that doesn't need a huge amount of introduction. Sort of so-called fake news came to the fore of the collective consciousness during the 2016 presidential election in the US, with things like these kind of crazy statements totally not true, fabricated, going viral, also things related to Brexit. And then there was redoubled concern around misinformation during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when in parallel with the actual pandemic, there was this infodemic of misinformation about COVID that still continues to this day. And then there was a new wave of misinformation during the 2020 election in the US around false accusations of voter fraud and things like that. And together, this, kicked off a huge amount of academic research around trying to understand why people believe misinformation and what to do about it. And this research has been overwhelmingly focused on the US and participants in the US and occasionally some in Western Europe. But the academic literature has been extremely US focused, but misinformation is very much not restricted to the US phenomena. These are just a few examples, but misinformation is a global phenomena, and by a lot of accounts, the problem is actually much larger in some other parts of the world than it is in the US. And so what we wanted to do in this research is to try to take a global view on the misinformation problem by conducting a really large cross-cultural experiment led by Antonio Arejar, who I see is in the audience, so excellent. There have been a few cross-cultural studies related to misinformation, usually looking at, a handful of countries and, one or two particular dimensions. And so we wanted to try to really do something pretty comprehensive. So Antonio ran this study with 34,000 subjects from 16 countries on 6 continents. We tried to really get a sort of diverse set of countries. We have the US and Mexico in North America. We have Brazil and Argentina in South America. We've got the the UK, Italy, and Spain in Europe. We have Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. We have Nigeria and South Africa in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we have Russia, China, India, the Philippines, and Australia. And so this gives us, a lot of coverage. And because we are particularly interested in social media, we focus on social media users and on online surveys. So we used Lucid, which is an online survey platform or company, recruitment company, to recruit subjects. And most of them were recruited in March, but sort of February to April 2021 to do an approximately 15-minute survey. And we asked at the beginning what social media platforms people used, but it was a very broad definition. It included WhatsApp, for example. And so we have Russia in there. So we used a large fraction. Almost everyone had social media. Only something around fewer than 5% of people were excluded in most countries due to not having social media. We also had some trivial attention checks at the beginning of the survey, and so people that failed those were kicked out. And we had good attrition afterwards. It was only roughly 3% of people dropped out at some point after the screeners, which is quite low. And we wanted to try to be as representative as we could. So the Lucid offered quota matching on age and gender. So for every country, we matched the national distribution on age and gender quite well. We couldn't match on other characteristics. And in particular, the education level was substantially higher for a lot of our subjects than the national distribution. Although it's unclear whether, what exactly the right comparison is this for social media users versus the country at large. But this is one way in which our samples were not super representative. But we got a pretty good match in terms of values. We had 4 different questions related to ideology from the World Values Survey. And in most of the countries, the distribution that we see on those measures in our sample is reasonably well aligned with what you see in the World World Values Survey. So this, suggests to us that we're getting, although not a perfectly representative sample, a reasonably representative sample. And the basic design of the study is after doing the sort of introductory things of, saying what social media platforms they use and passing some attention checks, each subject was shown 20 statements or headlines about COVID-19. Half of them were true and half of them were false. And these were sampled from a larger set of 30 false and 15 true statements that we assembled by looking at fact-checking websites, and the WHO maintains a list of misconceptions about COVID, or misinformation about COVID, and things like that. And so on each statement, they rated it using a 6-point Likert scale. Oh, right, and we also presented them with no image and no source information. So it's just, here's the statement. And depending on which condition they were in, which I'll talk about in a minute, what they were asked to rate differed. But they rated each headline, and then they continued to do a battery of other individual difference measures. So the place that I'm going to start is by talking about the accuracy condition. This is a quarter of the people were randomized to the accuracy condition. I should say it was like 2,000 subjects per country. So, like 500 people per country were asked for each statement to rate how accurate they thought it was. And we can start with just looking at country level means. So I'm going to show you the average accuracy rating, where 0 means they said, it was absolutely not true, and 1 means they said it was absolutely true. In the US, we see that, the average rating of about 0.6 for the true headlines and about 0.3 for the false headlines. This lines up pretty well with what we found before using both COVID headlines and political headlines. So people are good in the sense that the true headlines are rated as much more accurate than the false headlines, but they're also not great in that there's a reasonably high level of belief in false headlines, and there's a fairly much lower level of belief in the true headlines than you might like. And then when we look across countries, we see a pretty interesting pattern, which is there's actually not much variation across countries in the belief in true headlines, but there is a substantial amount of variation across country in the false headlines. And our paper is not really focused on trying to explain these country level differences, because we only have 16 data points. We only have 16 countries. And so if you're doing correlations with 16 data points, it's not, you don't really have that much. Even though you have 30,000 people, you don't actually have a ton of power for looking at country level differences. And instead, what we were really trying to understand is, for this section of the project, we wanted to know who is it that falls for misinformation, what are the features of individuals that predict falling for misinformation, and to what extent are those relationships robust across countries versus variable across countries. And we're going to sort of look at variables suggested by a few different theoretical perspectives. The first one, which is where we focused a lot of our prior research in the US, is what I'll call the sort of cognitive perspective on misinformation belief. And the idea from this angle is saying that, people vary in the extent to which they rely on their intuition versus stopping and thinking sort of analytically or deliberatively. This is this kind of system 1, system 2 dual process lens on decision making. And we have found in the US that in people that tend to rely more on their intuition, that is, who are less likely to stop and think, they're more likely to believe misinformation, and they're worse in particularly at telling true from false. And for all of this, we want to understand that our key outcome is how good are people at differentiating truth from falsehood. And so we measured sort of cognitive sophistication in a few different ways. We used the cognitive reflection test, this set of questions with intuitively compelling but wrong answers. So there's Enrique asked a question in the chat that I think is actually totally critical, which is that doing these kinds of cross-cultural studies using misinformation is extremely hard. In general, because every country has its own political environment, its own news environment. And so if you're going to come up with a set of statements, you're going to have different statements for every country. And then you can't really compare across countries, because any differences you might see could be due to differences in the statements rather than the actual people. But COVID offers this unique opportunity to do a really cross-cultural experiment, because you can come up with a set of headlines that are relevant everywhere in the world. And so in choosing this set of 30 false and 15 true statements, we chose them in a way that they would be universally relevant. And so we could ask them in all countries in a meaningful way.
Dave, real quick, Dave, do you have any examples of such questions?
Yeah, Antonio, can you just pop some in the chat and try to put the list in there?
Great, thanks.
So, there were some things about like false claims about side effects, like people dying from the vaccine, some things about false cures, like lemon is going to, cure you. Something about there being, fetuses in the vaccines or whatever. So we have the cognitive reflection test, these questions with intuitively compelling but wrong answers. We have a one item from the need for cognition measure, which is just a sort of self-report. So I'd rather do something that requires a little thought than something that's sure to challenge me, and we reverse coded it. And we also just had two other attention checks through this study that measure how much people are paying attention. And for this and all the other analyses in this section, for each individual difference, we run a model that predicts the accuracy of rating that the subject gives to the headline as a function of a dummy for whether the headline is true or not, the individual difference, and the interaction between those two things. And that's our key measure, which is looking at sort of how much does this individual difference change the relationship between the actual accuracy of the headline and how accurate people perceive it to be. And then we also include controls for age, gender, whether they have a college degree or not, and their relative socioeconomic status using this ladder measure of where do you put yourself on a ladder relative to everyone else in your society. And all of these things also interacted with headline veracity. So the key prediction here is we expect a positive interaction between each of these measures and headline veracity, such that people that score higher on these things, for people that score higher on cognitive sophistication, whether the headline is true or not has a greater influence on whether they believe it. And what I'm going to show you in this chart is we're going to have one row for each individual difference, and this is going to show you the coefficient on the interaction between that individual difference and the objective veracity of the headline. And these are sort of in percentage points. So this is basically saying like a 1 standard deviation increase in preference for thinking increases the difference in accuracy ratings of true versus false headlines by 4 percentage points. And what you see is the large dot is the meta-analytic effect from a random effects meta-analysis across all of the 16 countries with 95% confidence intervals, and each individual dot is one country. And so what you can see is for all three measures of sort of cognitive sophistication, there's a highly statistically significant meta-analytic positive effect, and the effect is positive in every single country, although the size varies to some extent. So this is like quite consistent evidence of a link between cognitive sophistication and the ability to discern truth from falsehood. All of these effects are controlling for education, and education on its own is also positively associated with discernment, but not as much as these actual measures of cognitive sophistication. And this is, sort of echoes results that we found in the US, both correlationally, and then there's also causal evidence that we have, like if you put people under time, pressure, and load, that makes them more likely to believe false statements. If you tell people to rely on emotion, that makes people more likely to rely on false statements. So the next set of measures we are interested in come sort of, rather than a cognitive perspective, from more of a social perspective. Eugen asked a question in the chat about exposure to the CRT, and this is one of these great results that I love because it really contradicts people's intuitions. It turns out that exposure to the CRT doesn't make you better at the CRT and doesn't make the CRT less predictive. Because the thing is, if you get the CRT wrong, you don't know that you got it wrong, you think you got it right. And so we have a paper in JDM where we show that we have a panel data set and we look at, changes in CRT performance over successive trials, like spaced, by months apart sometimes. And you just don't really see much improvement. So I think concerns about exposure to the CRT people are more worried about it than they need to be. Okay, so another perspective on misinformation is a more social perspective, where, and there's different sort of lines of theorizing that could come out of the social perspective. One is focused on the role of motivation. Motivation is this key driver of attitudes and behaviors. And there's lots of motivations not related to accuracy that people have stipulated as things that could be relevant in the context of misinformation. Things like, partisanship, system justification, need for chaos, things like that. And there's many of these. So rather than measuring these, what we focused on is the counterpoint of it is that people that are motivated to have accurate beliefs or are motivated for accuracy should believe in falsehoods less. And so to get some insight into this, we asked two questions related to this. One asked, when forming political opinions, do you think people should follow what their preferred party says or rely on evidence and arguments? So this is about sort of motivations to form your opinions in a sort of accurate way. And the other one is when deciding what to share on social media, how important to you is it that it's accurate? And then another sort of social perspective could focus on trust. There's lots of research on individual and national differences in interpersonal trust. And you might imagine that people that are more trusting are more susceptible to misinformation because they're just kind of more gullible. And so if you trust people in general, then you're going to be more likely to believe what people tell you. And so we just have a general question about how much do you trust the people that you interact with in life. And so now, same thing, I'm going to show you the interaction with veracity for each of these items. And for the two items related to accuracy motivations, we again find strong, highly significant and consistent in the sign across all country relationships where people that are more motivated towards accuracy, that have higher, stronger accuracy motivations, also have more accurate beliefs. In contrast, we did not find much of a relationship with trust. And so it's not the case that people that are more trusting are more gullible. It seems like this kind of interpersonal trust is a separate thing from whatever it's going on with misinformation belief or non-belief. And the third big set of sort of theorizing and data that is done in the US is around ideology. And in particular, there are a lot of studies in recent years that suggest that conservatives are more susceptible to misinformation than liberals, although it's always, and some people like John Jost will argue that that's because of fundamental psychological features of conservatism. But I think a lot of other people attribute this more to this particular moment in American politics where the right has kind of embraced misinformation as a tool more so than the left. So we wanted to know, does this generalize outside of the US? And also we wanted to consider other relevant dimensions of ideology beyond just conservatism. So now obviously in a cross-cultural survey, you can't ask people, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Because that's not a meaningful thing. And so what we did is we took items from the World Values Survey, and in particular, to get at conservatism, we used this question about whether the government should take more responsibility to ensure that everyone is provided for versus people should take more responsibility to provide for themselves. The sort of classic government versus individual responsibility tension, which is at the core of a lot of conservative ideology. We also asked how important it is to live in a country that's governed democratically, the extent to which people think incomes should be made more equal or there should be greater incentives for individual effort, and a sort of moral relativism question, the extent to which people think that it's hard to decide which moral rules are the right ones to follow. And we also looked at belief in God. And so what we find across these different dimensions of ideology is sort of some heterogeneous results. So the thing that is the strongest and is actually pretty much the overall strongest relationship, except for the accuracy motivation question, is that people that say it's important to live in a democracy are better at telling truth from falsehood in these COVID headlines, which is pretty interesting. And then also, I would say, honestly, to my surprise, we found that this negative correlation between conservatism and truth discernment was actually pretty general. It's significant. It's not big, but it's significant in the meta-analysis, and it's directionally negative in the large majority of the countries. So this suggests maybe it's not something unique to, to this particular moment in time in US politics. We also find that people that believe in God in most countries are worse at telling truth from falsehood. And we didn't find any consistent relationships for these other dimensions of ideology. Although another interesting result is across all of these different things, we found that people with more extreme opinions were better at telling truth from falsehood from people that were kind of apathetic and didn't really care much one way or the other, which is presumably some kind of measure of general engagement. Finally, we also looked at a bunch of demographics that we collected. These were things that we didn't have any particular theories or hypotheses about, but just, it's interesting to see as long as we're here. And so we found that in most countries, older people were better at telling truth from falsehood. Urban people that lived in urban, like in more dense population, dense areas were better at telling truth from falsehood. We found that higher SES subjects were actually worse at telling truth from falsehood, but looking at nonlinear effects, that's mostly driven by the highest level of SES, and that may be people that either are detached from reality, so think that they're doing better than everyone else, even though they're not actually, or people that are just kind of saying that. We didn't find big differences based on gender or risk preferences, and we found that people that identified as members of minority groups were more susceptible to the COVID misinformation relative to ethnic majority groups. And then the last thing that we did with this part of the study is there have been various papers in the US. So in terms of nonlinear with age, it's basically just flattening. There's no U shape or anything. It's just if you fit a quadratic model, you see that it sort of levels off at some point, but it doesn't dip back down. And we should say we did that. We looked at quadratic versions of all of these, and nothing was qualitatively different than what you get out of the that. This is 500 people per country, so 500 times 16. And rest attitudes was a single item, how that from the Doman et al. Paper of like, how are you someone that's generally prepared to take risks or whatever the other option is. That's been shown to correlate with risk taking across lots of different domains. And so another thing that has been observed in the West is a correlation between belief in COVID misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. So we wanted to look at that. And so we asked two different questions. One was, how likely are you to get the COVID vaccine? And the other one is, how much do you think what fraction of other people in your community do you think are going to get the COVID vaccine? I remember we ran this in March 2020 before vaccines were widely available. So this is sort of people's prospective, what do you think you're going to do? And you see everywhere this positive correlation where people that are less believing the falsehoods are more likely to get the vaccines. And I should clarify that these aren't marginal effects. Each one is a separate model, but all of them include controls for age, gender, SES, and education. So that's the sort of end of the predictors of misinformation belief section. And what I would sort of take from this in summary is, first of all, cognitive and social factors both seem important. And there's a remarkable amount of consistency across countries, more so than I might have expected in a lot of these measures. So it suggests that maybe there is some like fairly general psychology underlying misinformation susceptibility.
Dave, two quick methodological questions before you move on. One is, Gianluca asked before, are your questions about accuracy, are they incentive compatible? Do you give people any type of monetary reimbursement or something to get it right? Or is it just purely, you ask them for accuracy and that's it?
So there's no incentives, and I think it's actually important, and that asking incentives messes it up. Because if you incentivize somebody's responses, you're no longer asking them what they think is true. You're asking them what they think you think is true. And so I actually think it's, I came from an experimental economics background where it was like, well, you have to incentivize everything, otherwise it doesn't mean anything. And then when I started working on these beliefs, I was like, oh, shoot, we have to stop doing these incentives. Like incentivizing here is actually problematic. So I get that question pretty regularly, and I really think that it's not, it's not good to incentivize responses.
Well,
so I have a second part question, which is your trust question is, do you trust in people is a rather specific one, right? So your importance of democracy one could be, do you think it's correlated with, say, trust in science, trust in government, because that's, or trust in media, right? Because those are really the trust questions that matter a lot when you think about the messages that you get about COVID. So what do you think?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, if one wanted to dig deeper into the trust angle, asking about trust in various institutions and things like that would be definitely the way to go. And so I guess we were thinking about this in more like from a more psychological angle of just fundamental gullibleness or sort of like general trustingness. But I'm sure I would be shocked if trust in science was not correlated with better truth discernment. In our first COVID misinformation paper that we ran in the US, we found that science knowledge was strongly correlated with discernment. I expect that the same thing would be generally true here. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is I'm going to shift from thinking about beliefs to thinking about sharing. And understanding information sharing is important. In particular, we're going to focus on sharing on social media. It's important because that's how people, believe, get exposed to information. But also, there's this evidence from 40 years of cognitive science, and we showed that it's true with this kind of fake news stuff, that simply being exposed to content, even if it's crazy, makes people subsequently believe it more. So exposure in and of itself is problematic. And so, when we first started doing research on misinformation, we assumed that sharing was just like a behavioral measure of belief. And consistent with that, if you ask people, when you're deciding whether to share a piece of content, how important is it to you that it's, accurate, interesting, funny, aligned with your politics, or surprising? This is data collapsed across all 16 countries, but the pattern is pretty much identical everywhere. What you see is people overwhelmingly rate accuracy as the most important factor when deciding what to share. So this would be, this would support this interpretation that sharing is, going to indicate what people think is accurate. And yet, in some of our other work, in the US, we found a pretty big disconnect between accuracy and sharing, such that people are actually much more discerning when they make accuracy judgments than if they're asked to decide what to share. And so we wanted to see how general this was. And so in the second experimental condition is the sharing condition, where for each item, instead of being asked to rate how accurate it is, people are asked, this should say subjects are asked how likely they would be to share it. And so the accuracy condition rates accuracy, sharing condition, they give sharing likelihood. And so then what we want to do is we want to compare the level of discernment, that is the difference between true and false headlines, when people are rating accuracy versus when people are doing sharing. And because the general range, the people use the scales differently, we z-score sharing decisions and we z-score accuracy decisions, so that you kind of are standardizing the measures to sort of make it a fair comparison. Although honestly, when you don't standardize it, it looks pretty much the same. And so what I'm showing you here is for each country, the level of discernment in the accuracy condition versus the sharing condition. So for example, what this means is, like in the US, people rated accuracy, they rated in the accuracy condition, they rated true stories as 0.8 scale points more accurate than false stories. But when the people in the sharing condition, or I guess actually, 0.8 standard deviations, because they're standardized. So they rated true stories 0.8 standard deviations more accurate than false stories. Whereas in the sharing condition, they only said that they were 0.2 standard deviations more likely to share true headlines compared to false headlines. So they were much more discerning in their accuracy judgments than they were in their sharing judgments. And Yeah, sorry. So the sharing intentions is a 6-point Likert. From just like, how likely are you to share this with a 6-point Likert? And what you see is that essentially everywhere this disconnect occurs, where people are more discerning in their accuracy judgments than their sharing judgments. Although, interestingly, there are some places where this disconnect is happening less than others. And in general, the disconnect, the places where there's not such a disconnect between accuracy and sharing, it's not because people are really discerning in their sharing, but it's those are the places where people are not very discerning in their accuracy. So people are sort of more confused in some places than others, as we saw earlier. And so the more confused they are, the less of a disconnect between accuracy and sharing they are. You could ask, what's the explanation for this? And what we've proposed in other work is that the reason that the sharing decisions are much less discerning than the accuracy decisions is that the social media context, even if you do really care about accuracy in some abstract sense, when you are on social media or even thinking about social media, it puts you in this mindset where your attention is directed towards social concerns. You're thinking about, well, if I share this, who will like it? How much engagement will it get? What will it say about me? And you're thinking about all that stuff, and you forget to think about, is it true? And this is something that I've actually experienced in my own life as a misinformation researcher, where I have at least once shared something because I thought it was great. And then an hour later, somebody was like, hey, is that actually true? And I was like, I did it myself. So this has become like a core dimension of our research, is trying to understand and focus in on the importance of attention or inattention in these kinds of contexts. And so the implication of this is, if part of this disconnect between accuracy and sharing is coming from people simply forgetting to think about accuracy, then it suggests an alternative approach to reducing misinformation sharing, which is just getting people to pay attention to accuracy. And the reason that it's really important to have additional approaches is the current approaches that are currently taken by social media companies involve using machine learning to spot bad content and partnering with professional fact checkers. But these are both, although both of these things are good, both of them are limited in different ways. Fact checkers sort of are not really scalable, can't keep up with the volume of misinformation produced, and the machine learning is just not that good because it's hard to generate good training sets, and there's this non-stationarity problem where the characteristics of misinformation are continually evolving. Christina?
Yes, Dave, I have a simple question. When I look at this table with sharing, we share for many different reasons. Okay. Now, my question here is sharing of information because I think is accurate and I want other people to know, or sharing of information because it's fun, or sharing of information for other reasons. So you disentangle these different reasons for sharing?
So in this work, we don't, but I get this comment a lot, but I think actually there's much less heterogeneity in why people are sharing misinformation than you might think. So for example, we have another paper where we found 2,000 people that had posted links, that had tweeted posts to debunked stories that, Snopes.com had said were false. And then we pulled the text, we pulled the tweet. So the people that just did a straight retweet, there's no indication of any kind of, oh, this is funny, or oh, this is wrong, or whatever. It's just basically endorsement. And so we pulled all of the ones where there was some text associated with it, and we had people rate, does this text in any way indicate at all that the person thinks that this may not be true? And what we found is there's only maybe like 3% of the fake news posts had any kind of questioning language attached to them. So I really think that the large majority of the sharing of this stuff is not done in an either corrective or, oh, it's funny way. We have another project we're working on trying to do that, at scale with a much larger set of tweets, but that's my sense of things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're looking for things beyond, machine learning and fact checking. And the implication of this disconnect between accuracy and sharing is that if you just get people to consider the concept of accuracy, if you direct their attention towards accuracy, that should make them more discerning in what they share. And so we've done this in various ways, but the thing that we've done the most in different studies and that we focus on here is what we're calling an accuracy nudge. Nudge has become a bad word, but in this case, it really is what Thaler and Studstein were talking about, in that it's not changing the action set. You're just kind of trying to shift people in some benevolent paternalist way without actually restraining their choices. And so what we do is at the beginning of the study, we say, before they know anything about what the study's about, we say, first, we'd like you to pre-test a news headline for future studies. We're interested in whether people think it's accurate or not. Just give your opinion on this one study, and then you'll go on to the main task. Sorry, this one headline. And then we show them one non-COVID related headline, ask them to judge the accuracy, and then they go on to indicate their likelihood of sharing the 20 COVID headlines as in the sharing condition. And the idea is that when you do this, rating the accuracy of this one headline at the beginning just primes the concept of accuracy such that you're more likely to reflect on accuracy when you go on, to make your sharing decisions. We've run a ton of these studies in the US. We have a working paper where we meta-analyzed all 20 experiments we ran 2017 to 2020. 26,000 American participants, find a super significant effect where nudging them to think about accuracy increases the quality of what they share, primarily by decreasing the sharing of false headlines. It works for both co-partisan and counter-partisan political news. It works for COVID news. It works for both conservatives and liberals. It works for a very wide set of headlines and prompts, and the effect lasts for the duration of the session. And so one question says, this is self-report sharing. And so that's right. Everything that I've told you so far is this self-report sharing measure, although I'll also briefly mention a field experiment we did on Twitter with actual sharing behavior. And so in the cross-cultural experiment, again, our nudge condition, as I said, where subjects first rate the accuracy of one non-COVID headline, and then they indicate their sharing intentions for 20 COVID headlines, same as in the sharing condition. And now what we're going to look at is in each country, how does the accuracy nudge change their discernment relative to discernment in the baseline? So this is the percentage change in discernment. And basically, this is discernment after the nudge divided by, or like discernment in the nudge minus discernment in the control divided by the control. So it's sort of what fold increase in discernment are you getting relative to the control? And what you can see is, so here's the US. So the effect in the US is bigger than the effect in most other places. But the effect is clearly not unique to the US. There is substantial variation across countries. The overall meta-analytic effect is highly significant and positive, about a 20% increase. The control, is nothing at the beginning. It's just, okay, you go and now say how likely you would be to share all these headlines. And so we say, like, this effect is not unique to the US, but we would like to understand this variation across countries. And so if you want to think about why would the effect of nudging people to think about accuracy vary across countries? Well, I told you before that the extent to which there is a disconnect in accuracy versus sharing varies across countries. And so if what the accuracy nudge is doing is just getting people to think more about accuracy when they're deciding what to share, then it should work in the places where there's a big disconnect. But in the places where there's not much disconnect, then getting them to think about accuracy shouldn't really help much. And so to test that sort of theoretical account about what variation should exist across countries, we plot the effect of the accuracy nudge as a function of how the difference in sharing discernment versus accuracy discernment. And we see that there's a very strong correlation across countries, that the nudge works really well in countries where there's a big disconnect between accuracy and sharing, And the nudge doesn't do much in countries where there's not actually much of a disconnect. So again, this is consistent with the idea that what the nudge is doing is just getting people to pay attention to accuracy more. You can do a similar analysis looking at variation across headlines, because the headlines vary in how accurate people think they are. And so we're going to look at the effect of the nudge on sharing for any given headline as a function of how accurate people in the accuracy condition think the headline is. And what you can see is this amazingly strong correlation where it's just the less accurate people think the headline is in the accuracy condition, the more the nudge decreases sharing of that headline. So this is all like strongly consistent with the idea that this nudge is getting people to pay attention to accuracy. The final condition in the experiment was in terms of attenuation. No, over the course of one experimental session, which is not very long, we don't see much attenuation. Obviously, if you deployed this in reality, eventually it would, and so you need some kind of strategic way of dealing with that. We also ran the tips condition. We just give some people some minimal digital literacy tips. We find that this is also consistent, like sort of works, not a huge effect, but it works. There's no significant variation across countries in the effect of the tips. The tips are about half as effective on average as the accuracy nudge. And so all of this has been with hypothetical sharing. And so really we want to know whether things work with real sharing. And so this is not part of the cross-cultural project. This is a study in a paper that we published in Nature last year, focusing on the US and US politics. But I mention it because it's obviously important to know whether any of this stuff works for actual sharing. So we created this set of Twitter bots, and we used the bots to follow over 130,000 people that had been sharing links to Breitbart or InfoWars, right-leaning misinformation sites. About 11,000 of them followed us back, which means now we can send them private messages. We excluded subjects ex ante who seemed like they might be bots themselves or who hadn't been tweeting recently. And so this left with us a little more than 5,000 subjects as the users as the subjects in our experiment. What we did is we sent them all a private direct message that was basically the same as the treatment in the surveys experiments. And to do causal inference, we used a stepped wedge design where everyone gets the message, but you randomize who gets sent the message on which day. So each day is like its own mini experiment with a treatment, and then the control is the people that haven't gotten the treatment yet. And then you aggregate that to get an overall treatment effect. And consistent with what we see in the survey experiments, we find a significant positive effect of the nudge on the quality of what people are sharing, as judged by fact checker ratings of the news sources that people are sharing information from. And just to visualize this, I'm showing you one dot per news source. The size of the dot is proportional to the pre-treatment tweet frequency. So this shows you these people were mostly sharing Fox News and Breitbart before we sent them the accuracy nudge. And this is the quality of the news source as judged by fact checkers. And this is the change in the fraction of tweets that contained links to that news source after receiving the nudge. So what you see is our little nudge, even though we selected these people because they shared Breitbart, nudging them to think about accuracy, significantly decreased the fraction of their tweets that had links to Breitbart and increased the fraction of links to mainstream sites. So this translated in about a 5% increase in the average quality and a more than tripling of the difference in number of links to mainstream versus misinformation sites. And the effect was specific to retweets, not primary tweets, which is consistent with this sort of attentional account, because retweets are when you're not paying close attention, whereas when you write a primary tweet, you're really paying a lot of attention to make sure you can get in that character limit and so on and so forth. And it also works even for people that have a lot of followers. And the implication of this is that platforms could do something along the lines of maybe as a pop-up here, or as I showed here, or in feed, occasionally while people are scrolling through their news feed, ask them, hey, help inform our algorithms, how accurate is this headline? And just show them random headlines. And the point is, even if they threw away the answers to these questions, just asking the question would get people to improve the quality of what they share because it gets them more inclined to think about accuracy. And so I think there's a lot of advantages to this. I'll just say this quickly because I'm low on time. It's sort of a distributed solution that doesn't need the centralized definition of true or false. And so is scalable. Simulations show it's amplified by network effects. And obviously, like if platforms were serious about this, they could figure out ways to do it really well because they can run these experiments at large scales and cheaply, whereas for us, it took a lot of work. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is what I was saying is you could just throw out the responses to this question, and just asking the question will help because it will get people to think about things. But we also wanted to know, should they throw out the answers, or might the answers actually be useful in trying to help identify misinformation at scale? Because fact checking is great. The problem is just the fact checkers can't keep up. So we had a paper that we did using US data where in collaboration with Facebook, they gave us access to a set of URL links that their internal algorithms had flagged as things that they needed fact checks for. And then we had 3 fact checkers research each article and rate its accuracy. And we also had like 1,100 MTurkers just read the headline and lead and say how accurate they thought it was. And so we wanted to know how well the fact checker research lined up with the crowd ratings. And we also wanted to look at that as a function of how big the crowd is, that is sort of how many lay people were rating each headline. And we varied whether we told them the domain or not. And so this is the correlation between the lay people and the fact checkers as a function of the crowd size. And as a benchmark, we used just how much agreement there was between the fact checkers themselves, because the fact checkers were far from unanimous. And what we found, is that with fewer than 20 lay people per headline, you got as much agreement between the lay people and the fact checkers as the fact checkers had with each other. And so that, I think, actually makes crowdsourced misinformation identification seem quite promising. But we also wanted to know whether this was unique to the US or not. And so in the cross-cultural paper, we took the data from the accuracy condition, where we had 500 people rating the accuracy of these COVID headlines. And for these COVID headlines, we had a just binary, is it true or is it false? So you can look at what's the average rating from the accuracy condition, from the people rating the headline, use that to classify headlines as true or false. And you can ask what's the AUC, the sort of standard measure of accuracy in non-balanced sets for machine learning. It's basically the rating of, if I showed you one true headline and one false headline, what's the likelihood that the true headline would be rated higher than the false headline? And what you can see is that in basically all countries, in almost all the countries with 20 or fewer layperson ratings per headline, you're doing better than 90%, like an AUC above 0.9. And so this suggests that crowdsourcing, the ability of crowds to identify misinformation is not unique to the US, but seems to be like quite a general phenomenon. So, and this is something that social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter are both pursuing. And we sort of have been advising on both of these efforts, and I think it's cool that these ideas are sort of getting out into practice. So to wrap up, from this big cross-cultural study, I think there's a striking degree of cross-cultural regularity in both the psychological predictors of misinformation susceptibility and also the effectiveness of various interventions. There's evidence that cognitive factors, social factors, and ideological factors are all relevant for understanding who falls for misinformation and who doesn't. There's evidence that it's a quite general phenomena that sharing judgments are less discerning than accuracy judgments. And it seems that interventions developed in the US, at least the ones that we looked at, all generalized reasonably broadly across cultures, which I think is encouraging for intervention research, particularly given that so much of that intervention research is happening in the US. And in particular, shifting people's attention to accuracy and providing digital literacy tips seem to increase the quality of information that the users were choosing to share, and crowdsourcing seems like a promising way to identify low quality information. And both of these are scalable approaches to combating misinformation that don't rely on a centralized authority deciding what to censor or not. So I feel like that's, in some sense, I feel like good news in that I feel like we're starting to get a handle on why people believe these falsehoods and what to do about it. But the thing that I want to conclude with is saying that this whole body of work grew out of the sort of 2016 era misinformation concerns that you could sort of encapsulate with the Macedonian teenager making up crazy headlines to try to have them go viral in the US and get clicks. And that I think that either the nature of the misinformation problem or our understanding of the misinformation problem in the US, and for sure this is true cross-culturally, has evolved to be less about we're viral misinformation and more about misinformation coming from political elites in coordinated top-down misinformation campaigns. And so I think that the psychology of these kinds of elite-based misinformation is likely quite different from the more viral misinformation. And so that's where my group is investing a lot of effort these days, is trying to understand the role of elite messaging, how you counter elite messaging and things like that. And there's a big literature in political science on this that we're now sort of dipping into. So thanks everyone for your attention. These are a bunch of the people involved in this work, although not all of them because there are so many people that they can't fit them on a slide. And here are also people that gave us funding for our whole sort of body of work. So yeah, thanks so much for your attention and looking forward to questions and discussion.
Great, Dave. Thanks so much. Maybe if you want to keep sharing your screen,
I guess that makes sense.
Questions come up. Okay. So this was amazing, and thanks for the run through all the many studies. Antonio did a great job. He was bombarded with questions, and he responded to many. So let me start with something maybe a little bit more controversial, because I think this is the right time to ask this question, and then we can catch up on some of the open questions, which is those of you who follow you or Gord on Twitter, they might have seen this recent back and forth with Sander and Jay and sort of on their psych science paper, where they found like some results that go a little bit against your results, seemingly against your results of the impact of accuracy nudge on conservatives and whatnot. So maybe just to get your obviously biased opinion on what's going on, maybe you can provide some insights and also maybe catch up some of the people who don't know what I'm talking about as to what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So we have written a few papers on accuracy nudges, and Sander van der Linden and his group successfully replicated one of the papers that we had in Psych Science on COVID misinformation. And so then Sander and Jay Van Bavel and a couple of their students did this a little meta-analysis of, in the main thing that they focus on, it's basically like 3 studies from our Nature paper, our COVID study and their COVID study. And they found that in this meta-analysis, the accuracy nudge worked better for liberals than it did for conservatives. But as I mentioned before, we have this much larger meta-analysis that includes basically all of the studies in their meta-analysis plus another 15 studies. And we don't find that basically. So when you just have a lot more data, what you see is that getting people to think about accuracy works for both liberals and conservatives. If you look at partisanship on MTurk, in sort of totally convenient sample MTurk studies, the effect works less well for Republicans than it does for Democrats. But in more representative samples, that's not the case. Most of our more representative samples come from Lucid, which is quota matched, so it's still not like a real representative sample, but it's in that direction. And we have one big study that we ran on an actual representative sample from YouGov, where we had 200 different headlines, so like a really large set of headlines. We've looked at 3 different interventions for nudging people to think about accuracy, and we did it in an actually representative sample. And there, we actually found directionally the opposite effect, that if anything, the accuracy nudge worked better for the Republicans than it did for the Democrats. And so we have a working paper for that we're going to plan to post in the next few weeks, probably. So I think pretty solidly, when you look at representative data, it's not the case that it doesn't work for Republicans in general. But actually, this does raise one more general point, which is that when you're thinking about the accuracy nudge, again, if the point is that what the accuracy nudge does is align people's accuracy judgments with their sharing intentions, that shows you it's only going to work for false headlines that people think are false. So if there is some falsehood that a particular set of people have adopted as truth, for example, many Republicans in election fraud, then this is not going to work, because when you get them to think about accuracy, they're going to be like, yeah, great, it's accurate, I'm going to share it. So there's a clear boundary condition there, which is this works for things, for falsehoods that people don't believe.
David, sorry to interrupt here. I think what you're saying is fundamental. Because what I was thinking is, well, what are the priors of these people? Okay. And if I am a Republican and my priors are that Democrats are a bunch of criminals, basically, obviously, I will believe and take as true all the statement and the news about electoral fraud. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not that simple. So for sure, this is another one of the experiments, the survey experiment from the Nature paper, where we showed people a set of political headlines, and half of the people were asked to judge accuracy, the other half were asked to judge sharing. And when you look at the accuracy judgments, here I'm splitting it up by whether it's true in orange and false in green, and whether it aligns with their politics versus whether it doesn't. It's true that people believe the things that align with their politics a bit more than the things that don't align with their politics. But the differences are not that big. And maybe more importantly, the difference is exactly the same for the true headlines as it is for the false headlines. So if you want to look at how good are people at telling true from false, they're actually just as good and maybe even a little better at telling true from false for the concordant headlines as the discordant headlines. And in our TICS paper on psychology of fake news, we show that this is robust across a whole bunch of experiments, that political alignment is actually not a great predictor of ability to tell truth from falsehood. And even more importantly, when you look at sharing, the pattern is totally different. And so here, basically, for the same set of headlines, and people randomized to one condition versus the other, so no systematic differences between the people, the accuracy judgments are really primarily driven by the objective truth of the headline, whereas the sharing decisions really are not. And so it suggests that there's, particularly for the concordant false headlines, but more generally. And so it suggests that this isn't just something about, oh, people believe everything that's congenial to their ideology and therefore are sharing it, but that there's some real disconnect going on here for a lot of stuff.
Good, thank you.
Great. So Dave, can you just clarify one thing and then we move on to the next question, which is, you mentioned you have much more data than the study by Jay and colleagues, but the meta study that you use only uses your own study data, right? And what they use also uses other people's studies. Is that correct? Or do you all have overlapping studies?
Only one study. Okay. That is, we've run all the studies.
All right. Sounds good. So I encourage people to check out that back and forth between you guys. It happened like last week, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find that. But so let me just give Michael the opportunity to ask a question. Ask like two longer questions. So Michael, if you just want to ask them, or one.
So I had two questions actually. So one was about for older adults. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in, is like how misinformation functions in older adults. They know that there is some data out there saying that older adults actually share more misinformation on Facebook, but I saw you showed that older adults are more able to judge accuracy, and we've actually found some preliminary data, at least using a continued influence effect paradigm, that older adults are actually better at incorporated corrections also. So I guess I'm curious, one, just have you looked at the effect of age on accuracy nudges, and what accuracy, I mean, it seems like the prediction would be that accuracy nudges would be more effective for older adults, but I'm curious if you've looked at that. And then I guess anything else about like this dissociation between, like, why would there be a bigger dissociation between sharing and accuracy potentially in older adults? And then my second question was just, I was kind of more general. Are you looking at anything? So I guess and I'm doing some work on the continued influence effect. And one thing that I think that gets at, that some of your work doesn't, is this question of like, you might have something that you might have misinformation about, especially a political candidate or about COVID, and you just feel like you don't like that person or that product or something, and you can't even necessarily I mean, you might even say like, oh yeah, that misinformation that I heard, yeah, that's false. But you'll still feel like you don't like that person. I'm curious, like, so I feel like the continued influence effect is kind of one way of modeling that. Just curious if you guys are doing anything else kind of along those lines to get at that effective misinformation.
Yeah, so Ari, the age thing, it's a big it's one of, in my mind, the biggest open questions in this area, because it's not as simple as, well, older people are more discerning in their accuracy judgments, but less discerning in their sharing. Because the problem is, in survey experiments, looking at sharing intentions with sort of representative-ish samples or with M-Turkers, whatever, what you see is that older people share less fake news. They believe less fake news and they share less fake news. So it's really about a disconnect between the survey experiments and the actual social media, which could be about who selects into survey experiments, but it could also be about who selects into high social media usage. And my guess is it's at least partially the latter, which is the old people that are super active on Facebook are not representative of old people in general. And I just dropped a link in the chat to this Twitter post, I think from today, of this guy, Ben Lyons, who just posted a working paper looking at age and sharing and trying to sort out this difference between the survey experiments and the actual social media data that will probably be of interest to you. And for what it's worth, in the survey experiments, we find that the accuracy nudges do work better on the older adults. But I think there's something weird going on with age and this that someone should get to the bottom of.
Cool.
The other question was about, oh yeah, right. So I think that this is a big issue, that the way I would characterize it is like, what is it that really matters when you're worried about misinformation? Is it literally, did the people believe that fact or not? Or is it like, how does it affect their attitudes and behaviors more generally? And what is the connection between those, like the beliefs and the behaviors, and how does fixing the belief, affect the attitudes and so on? And I think that that's something that way more work needs to get done on. And I think that's a super important area. We don't have anything. It's like very much, it's on our minds, but we don't have anything actively cooking on that.
Well, yeah, and I would just say, I mean, I feel like one reason why that's so important is you get like the incentives for someone like Donald Trump. He's probably figured out over his decades as a con man, like, oh, I can say something nasty about someone, and even if it gets corrected, like in a competitive zero-sum atmosphere, like it still helps him, like it still hurts whoever he targets.
Right.
Yeah.
My sense is that Trump has reshaped norms around this, where it used to be that if you got caught saying something that wasn't true, there were more reputational concerns. But he just like so wholesale embraced it that has kind of shifted the the Overton window or whatever about what's acceptable there. There is this cool paper, by the way, on that where people, you probably know it, with like Lewandowski and Berinsky and Bryony Swire and some other people, where they showed that correcting the politicians' lies it corrected the factual beliefs, but it didn't change people's attitudes about the candidate. It's something called like he's our liar or something. It's the
right. Okay, yeah, that does sound familiar. I think I've seen that around. I don't remember the exact finding, but yeah, that is kind of what I'm getting at, I think.
Great. Well, so we're at the end of our time. Dave, that was amazing as expected. Antonio, thanks for taking care of the questions. There's still a few unresolved questions in the chat, so feel free to bombard Antonio by email, I guess, and get your responses there. And
one thing I would say before everybody leaves is feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions. We don't have a working paper for the cross-cultural study yet, although we hopefully will soon. But I'm going to drop a link to a Google Doc that has links to all of our papers related to misinformation, and where we will add the preprint. I mean, we'll tweet it and stuff also, but this is a dynamic doc that's always updating with new links. So if people want to keep track of what's going on with our misinformation work, you can stop back to this Google Doc anytime.
Great. All right. So then, thanks everybody for attending. Come back in 2 weeks when we have Rachel Cranton, and then have a great day, and see you in 2 weeks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.